Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Sheila, you want to introduce JJ? So thank you all for coming to our monthly Lunch and Learn series about the Sanaga Creek watershed as part of the Sanaga Creek Watershed Partnership. I'm the chair of the board. Thank you all for coming. I'll put in the chat our website if you want more information about us. But with that, I'll introduce Sheila McFarland, our chair emeritus and all-around awesome person who knows JJ much better than I, so we'll introduce JJ.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Basically, I want to not forget, for those of you, I've gotten several requests from people about, will this be recorded and posted? And the answer is yes. So in a few days, you should be able to access it, and anybody else who missed it because they have a dental appointment or whatever, it'll be there. So I do want to introduce JJ. JJ is known to an enormous amount of people. She's an award-winning historic preservation person, community advocate, educator, and has many, many roles. Columnist in the Vail Voice. JJ has been acknowledged by being labeled an Arizona culture keeper, which is outstanding. And she's also on CWP's Wall of Honor, which is a virtual Wall of Honor. And you could read more about her if you go to the Wall of Honor. For a long time, she helped to form the Vail Preservation Society, the director of it for a long time. She's been trying to connect new people in the Vail area to the things that were there before. And so we really appreciate that. It's a vital role. I was going to introduce Gerald as her assistant, but that's really unfair. Gerald's really her partner. There you go, Gerald. Gerald got his master's in history from MNA. And
NAU, yeah.
I mean, yes. Sorry. Okay, one of those universities. His specialty is history and documentary filming, which I'm really interested in seeing what's going on there, and has done some filming and also an exhibit some of you might have seen at the Lowell Planetarium. Space Guards?
Yeah, Space Guard, yeah.
Space Guard.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all about contemporary asteroid research.
Okay. So he's not just JJ's son, but anyway, so with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'm pretty excited about this presentation, and I suspect we'll have another look at it, whenever we get the chance. So JJ or Gerald, have at it.
Okay. And I'm excited about doing this presentation. Has really helped us start to put some form to many of these repeat photographs that we've been doing over the years. So I'm excited. And I'll just share that Sheila is a big part of our current Rancho del Lago estate repeat photograph project. And we'll see a little bit of that towards the end of the presentation. So thank you all for joining. So every picture tells a story. And so repeat, or sometimes you hear it called then and now photography, are photographs taken of specific locations that document change over time. And sometimes that span is longer or shorter. And we'll see that with some of the projects. Most of our photographs are basically the past photograph and a current photograph. But this Rancho del Lago project that we're doing now, that is a continuing series because between Sheila and I, we get out there every week and take the same set of photographs. So why did we start doing, oh, you know what, I'm gonna stop here. The picture that we see in this opening slide is the Vail School, probably about 1915. And if you're familiar with the Vail area, this location was really right across the street from Old Vail Middle School. Then the new school was built in 1927, and it's set right about where the new administration and library sit and probably merged into what's now the big gymnasium. So we could go ahead and move forward. But we're going to look at some repeat photographs taken in and around the Vail area that really document the changing story of Vail.
I don't know if you just want to talk about this or.
Yeah, so I really like to think about each photograph. It's really a time capsule, and it captures information that we can use really to get a better idea of change and change over time. So one of the things I like about repeat photography is it really makes us look at a photograph in a different way. A lot of times we look at a photograph, we glance at it, and maybe we like the composition, maybe we like the colors, maybe we're very interested in the people or an event or a certain part of the landscape. But really, to get the most out of repeat photography, we need to look very carefully at the photograph and all of the little details that are embedded in there. Yeah, and I think the other thing that I really like about repeat photography is it really helps us to understand, especially community-based repeat photography, like what we're doing to document the changing history of Vail. It helps us understand our place in that changing world, and that we're part of something, a continuing story that's bigger than just our own story. And from my perspective, as I really work to get residents engaged in their community, I think that's an important thing, because we're not just, each of us is here for a short time, but we're part of that continuing story. We have, I think, a responsibility and obligation to our community. And so I look at repeat photography really as one of the tools in our toolbox to engage community. And Gerald, Sheila, and Robin, if you're here, always feel free to chime in at any time. Okay. We'll go to the next one. Okay, so what really can we do with repeat photography? We can document processes resulting from development or seasonal changes at a specific site. We can document land use at a specific site. I like repeat photography too because it gets us out in the landscape to ground truth and find those locations and experience it for ourselves. I mean, it's one thing to read about, say, a historical event that happened or some climate change process that's affecting wildlife or vegetation, but it's another thing entirely to get out there in the landscape yourself. And so I think that's a really important part of repeat photography. This first repeat photograph that we're looking at is of the Cooperite mine. This was, the photograph on your left was taken in about 1903. And the Cooperite mine is, if you were at Vail proper, between the original town site between the railroad tracks, this site would be just about 6 miles south. And if you're familiar a bit with the Vail history, there's a lot of mining involved in the history of Vail, especially in the Santa Ritas. And so this mine is kind of in the foothills of the Santa Rita Mountains. And the photograph on the right is a now photograph showing what that area looks like now.
Yeah, and I think probably a really important thing to bring up with this one is that I think often with this kind of photography, we expect there to be new things or more development in the now picture. But I think this can help clue us in that some places where we don't see anything today and we don't see evidence of things today, but through this process, through the repeat photography process, you can actually see that even though it doesn't look like people lived here or worked here or did things here in the past, we can actually say, no, they did. They were mining here, they built structures here, but they weren't built to last. They were built for a temporary purpose. And then, and as you can see now, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to tell that anything had been done. And so I think, and especially in Vail, where almost all of our historic buildings are vanished or are just scatters, that these kind of photographs, I think, can really, help bring these places back to life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, and help current residents understand that the story of Vail didn't start when their development was built in the time frame between 2001 and today. And in fact, Gerald used the word vanished. And that's what we've been calling this series of photographs is Vanished Vail. As we go around and discover those places and kind of bring them back to life for people's imaginations. So how else can we use repeat photography? It's, I think, a really effective tool to engage the general public. And it's also a very useful tool for interpretation, exhibits, and presentations. I think people really needs, you need to find ways to reach people that touch them personally. And so this kind of photography engages your imagination. Okay.
We already kind of talked about this a little bit.
Oh, what's that?
I was gonna say, we talked about this a little bit.
Yeah, we have already talked about some of this a little bit. I think the repeat photography really helps us understand the human-caused change that produces lasting impacts. That's one of the things I like about repeat photography. I find the general public tends to think that what I do doesn't have a lasting impact. But through repeat photography, we can demonstrate clearly that it does. One of the other things that I like about repeat photography is that it's something that we can use with young people. So we use this at the museum club that we have at Esmond Station K-8. And we did a little bit of this with the placemaking program at Old Vail Middle School last year. There's a photograph that we like to start out with that helps them imagine what Vail was like 100 or more years ago. This watercolor is from, it seems like it's 1893. And to start students really learning how to read a photograph and to imagine what life was like, and to then start thinking about all the changes over the last 120 years and how Vail is going to change in the future. This photograph is wonderful. And we get them to start looking at all of the details and to start thinking about, well, how do you know that this is in the Vail area? And anybody want to say how they think we might be able to place the location and cite this photograph? Any ideas?
Mountains?
The mountains. Yeah,
The mountains?
because all the things that the people are doing are ephemeral, but the mountains don't change. And so, especially now, well, we've had to pivot and we're doing our museum club virtually. But one of their tasks was to go out in their yard and hopefully with their family and try to locate the mountain range. Yeah, and I think getting feedback from the students, several of them really picked up on that, and they picked up on the changes in vegetation and that there were houses here now. Did you want to say anything more about that, Gerald, that from what the students said at the museum club?
Yeah, I think, one of the big differences you can see is that, well, first, it is a watercolor, so it's not, it can be hard to place this as like to what perspective in Vail, because it's possible it's kind of a composite of Vail. But the biggest thing I think the students noticed is that the mountains are very similar, right? We can line those up. We can see Rincon Peak. but the landscape looks radically different than what they're used to. They don't, there's not big thickets of cactus and creosote and mesquite. It looks like grass and dirt. I mean, it looks very, very different. And that's something that, the impact of cattle, the impact of erosion, the impact of development has changed the landscape pretty dramatically. And that's something that the repeat photography can do, I think, really well, because I think sometimes when you look at a landscape, and again, this is like, what you're saying, Mom, is it feels like the impacts and the things you're doing don't make a lasting, they don't matter in the long run. But you can see that something that you wouldn't think, 100 years of, after the introduction of cattle, what would that do? Well, you can see it radically changed the landscape. And so Vail 100 years ago doesn't look like Vail today. And I think this is a good place where we can then jump off and say, well, if this is what Vail looks like today, what do you think the things we're doing today are going to impact what Vail looks like 100 years from now? So I think it's a good way of building that connection, not just to the past, but to see yourself as part of the continuing story of Vail and place yourself as the people shaping the future, shaping tomorrow's Vail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the students really connected that this location could be right in the middle of their neighborhood right now, that there's all those houses, and to imagine those changes. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for jumping ahead to that, Gerald. So
oh yeah, I'll come back here to maybe the methods and process.
Oh yeah, let's do that. So how to get started doing this. Really, what I like to do before I go out and first you have to select what photos you're going to use. And you might have some wonderful photos in your collection or that you found at the Historical Society, but the photograph really has to have a reference point, something that hasn't changed, something that you can pin that photograph to so that you can frame your now photo. So locating and using those points of reference. And then you want to really spend some time and read the photograph. And actually with the Museum Club and other students, we have a little worksheet that we use that helps guide that activity. Because you don't want to just gloss over and quickly look at the photograph, although that's the first thing you do, but you want to pick out those details. And then I would say that once you start your, in the case of this Rancho del Lago project we're doing, that's a site under construction, so there's a lot of changes. So finding those points of reference that maybe have remained unchanged, or the location that you're going to take your photograph in the direction. That's important. And then if it's possible, if you're taking a repeat photograph of a historic photograph or this shorter repeat photography project, this location of the photographer, the time of year, the time of day, all of those could be really important. They're going to affect the shadows and how the quality of your repeat photograph. Did you want to talk about any more about that, Gerald?
Yeah, because I think that's there's a bunch of ways of going about doing a repeat photography, and there definitely is to try and match up photos exactly. Mm-hmm. So trying to match both the focal length of the lens, where the lens was focused, and the size of the capture medium, be that film or digital. All of that, and where the camera was, can radically change the perspective on things, and also the lens characteristics. Some of the repeat photos, as I was looking at them, have very strong warping on the edges in some of these old cameras, and it shifts and bends and warps the mountain ranges. And it's actually, sometimes it can be hard to line up the mountain ranges because they've been so distorted, and so that it's hard to even see where they would line up. So there is a whole technical side where we could go through, and something we're going to try and do is do some, trying to do some one-to-one recreations with, because we do know that some of the photographs were taken on most likely a Kodak Brownie using 120 film. And so we do have a Kodak Brownie, and we got some 120 film, and we're going to try and recreate as best we can. That way we can, it's a kind of a fun recreation. And then we'll also do a digital recreation, using a digital camera of the same photograph, and try and be really technical. And that's something that's kind of a, in the moving forward, that's something we're going to try and do, is match these up very technically. But you don't have to have a perfect technical recreation to still get benefit from the repeat photography, because even if it's close enough, similar enough, you can still see those changes. You might not have that perfect merging between past and present where everything lines up, but you can still see those changes. And actually, even an idea for repeat photography is just taking it in the same spot throughout the year, just to see the effects that the time of year has on someplace, right? Like what this changing seasons. So that's something that you want to think about is, what are you concerned about, and what are you trying to document in this series of photographs? Because if you're trying to document things like weather or seasonal changes, you might want to be taking these photos more frequently, so you have a much larger data set. But if you're kind of really only concerned with these very slow moving processes, then maybe you can get away with taking 2 photos a year or 1 photo a year at the same site. So I think that's part of this process, that method and process is, what am I trying to capture, and what kind of data am I hoping to get out of it? How, or what is the end use I'm trying to get out of it?
Yeah, and I would just say, if the end use is perhaps for an exhibit or to really connect with people, then if one can find a photograph that has people, that those are all things to think about. Yeah. Okay, we'll move forward. So I see repeat photography really as an opportunity to involve your volunteers, our citizen scientists, youth, and to partner with other organizations and find ways then to contribute that information, so it's useful.
The watercolor.
There's our watercolor. I love that one. Okay. I'll just say, on a personal level, I get super excited when I finally find that spot. When you think about how big the world is, and even how big, the Vail area is, say a little over 425 square miles, by our definition, to find that one little spot in the landscape is pretty exciting. So this is an image taken in 1927. As part of a Pima County project where they sent people out to schools to help educate about health and things like that. So this county extension person had taken a photograph of the Hilton Ranch Road, partly to show, I think, how much effort it took to get to some of these places. So who would ever think that we could find that exact spot again? But there it is. I just say I was super excited. That's, you have to do your happy dance. But it allows us to observe the changes over time. So
Yeah,
Gerald, you were talking about some changes that you noticed as you were putting this together.
Right. Yeah. Something I thought was really interesting, and something that I think is, an assumption we all take with us is that, and it's kind of, we use it in idioms and things, is, things are set in stone, right? We say that.
Yeah.
But if you compare the the rock faces, there has been a lot of erosion and crumbling of this rock formation in 100 years. I think between freezing, that process of it getting hot, rain, freezing, all of that has broken up this rock face considerably, and it has smushed down the hill probably 4 or 5 feet in 100 years. And so I think if we could look at this, if we had more photos, maybe 3 or 4 photos a year for that whole 100 years, I mean, it would almost probably look like it was sliding. I mean, and that the landscape was alive and undulating. And so I think it's a really good reminder that the human time scale is not the only time scale, and that just because we can't perceive something to be in flux and constantly changing and evolving doesn't mean it isn't so. And so I think that the repeat photography is really helpful for that, because something you'd think, oh, that rock face, that'll surely be exactly where it was 100 years ago. Not the case. So.
Yeah. And as I look at this photograph, I like to imagine those, they were middle-aged women coming out from Tucson to these remote school locations, driving in their little, Model T or Model A down these winding dirt roads, hoping they wouldn't have a flat tire.
Yeah.
No cell phones. Oh,
That's good.
Okay, this photograph was actually taken. So if you're familiar with Vail, you know that there's a Safeway that's located there now. Having a big grocery store, that was something the community really welcomed. But what used to be at that location until, I don't know, when did they take that hill down, Sheila? In about 2007 or 8, something like that?
Yeah, something like that. It's been a while. We never thought it would work, but obviously we were wrong.
You were wrong. Oh, there used to be a hill there, just to the east of Old Vail Middle School. And in trying to retake this photograph, I discovered that it's really hard to get the exact repeat photograph because the hill no longer exists. And so there's actually more to this photograph, and Gerald will talk in a minute about it, what he had to do to line it up. But I need to get someone with a lift that we can go out to the edge of that flat part behind Safeway and can lift one of us up in the lift so we can really replicate this repeat photo. But I like this photo, one, because Evie Schley is the wife of the person that built the old Vail post office. And if we could see that entire picture, you'd see that she had Bud the dog down at her feet. And so I find that it is easier to engage people in local history if there's a person in the image, and especially a pet that they can connect with. And this photograph worked well because it had a strong image of the mountains behind it. But we can definitely see a change in the landscape between when this photograph was taken, probably in about 1908, and today. Yeah,
and that was because of the hill is so much further back now, or I guess where you can actually stand at this height. So this had to be cropped and zoomed in considerably to get that frame. And so yeah, I think we'll have to do something with a cherry picker or a drone or something. We'll have to. There are lots of ways of trying to repeat it exactly, but it's challenging because that's again something you think like, oh well, of course that hill will be here 100 years from now. Well, no. Safeway had other ideas about that hill, so
yeah, exactly. When they were doing that, I thought it was kind of like when you build a pyramid, but this was in reverse.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Okay, now this photograph, I really love this photograph. It was taken at the Hilton Ranch School in 1927. And I like this photograph for many reasons. It shows the students having a great time, just like students do at school today. Well, maybe a year ago and 2 years from now. Not during the pandemic, especially. It shows the school building, and this was a brand new school at this point. It's pretty exciting. But it also shows us the hills behind it. And that allows us to line up the landscape. And so let's look at the, okay. And I'll just say with this particular photograph, it wasn't one that I intended to do as a repeat. I just was lucky in that I found a photograph I'd taken in about 2010 that lined up. And that's my mother in the photograph. She loved to go out exploring sites as well. I do intend to go out and take another repeat for the photograph of this site, but unfortunately, the schoolhouse burned. So there's not anything left at all. But we'll line up the hills and then we'll have a 3-part repeat. So
yeah, and I think that's a really kind of important lesson about photographs, is that often our intention for the photograph, we think of the photograph as having only one purpose, but to someone else, and maybe in the future, that photograph takes on entirely different meaning and value. And so, like this photograph, we had intentions of going back out there because this building had already been there 100 years. What's another 5 years?
Yeah.
And then there was that big fire that took out all of these historic buildings out there at the Hilton Ranch. And so the only photos we have are some that weren't taken for that purpose. So they're not perfect, but again, I don't think the photos have to be perfectly aligned to have value, because we can see the change in the landscape. We can see how the building weathered over time. And so I think there's still value in photographs, even if they're not always perfectly technically aligned or what have you.
Yeah. Okay. This is actually the oldest photograph we have of the old Vail post office. And at this point in time, it was called Schley's store. And Otto Schley is just about in the center of the photograph right there, standing in front of what we now call the old Vail post office. And we're going to see this merge to the present, or very nearly the present.
Cool. Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so this was a one where doing an exact repeat photo would give you this very tight crop of the building, and it wouldn't have a ton of context. And so in this case, it almost made more sense to give you the whole building and then just kind of punch in there at the beginning, just so you can see. And there are some other really interesting repeat photography projects that do this a little differently, but they only use part of the historic photograph layered on top of the contemporary photograph, and they kind of merge past and present in the same frame. So there are a lot of ways of approaching this. You can do kind of like a triptych or something, or you can superimpose them. There's lots of different techniques for this.
And that particular photograph, we did that with the intent of trying to help people imagine. That building has been sitting empty and unused and not really an active part of the community for many years now. But we need people to imagine what it was like when that was the bustling heart of Vail, and that was the place where everyone connected. And when that Knox Corbett, that's the man driving the car, it was taken in 1913. And when this little Old Vail Road right in front of the post office, that was the main drag. Everybody that came out from Tucson, and if you were going on to Bisbee or Douglas or points beyond, that was the main road. Everyone went by there. And then a few years later, it was going to become Highway 80 in 1926-27. The first southern all-weather coast-to-coast route went right through downtown Vail. Yeah, I wish we could find the original of that picture. that all we have is the photocopy of a newspaper. So that's why it's grainy. Okay,
Yeah,
now this is a great picture. This was taken at the Hilton Ranch School. These are the students of the Hilton Ranch School. And it's great because we can see the landscape behind it. So that allows us to line it up and imagine when that place was just a bustling beehive of activity, lots of families and its own school. And it's
Wow.
really, yeah, just the wildlife and the wind today.
I also think, this photograph is also really valuable in demonstrating like the human change over the last 100 years. The demographics of Vail have radically changed. Whereas it was a predominantly Mexican American community, and within the last 20 years has become overwhelmingly Anglo. And it went from being a poor rural community to being a more affluent suburban community. So I mean, there's kind of quite a bit of change that has happened in the last century, and really most of it accelerating change in the last 20 years.
Oh, absolutely. Since 2001, really the gentrification process is complete. It changes the whole face of the community. It changes our values. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I love that photograph too. And we see how the grasses have grown up. You can observe how the landscape has changed. Okay, I love this photograph. So, and really discovering the exact location. So these are 3 of the Bejarano children. The Bejarano family, they lived in various places in the greater Vail area and came to this country as a result of the Mexican Revolution. And so their family story is one that's really a familiar part of Vail's story, in that people followed the work. And so this family at one point, Chico is the little boy in the center, Francisco or Chico Bejarano. They worked, his father and older brothers worked at the Rosemont mine. For a while they lived at Greaterville. They lived at the Hilton Ranch. They lived in Pantano, and they lived in Vail. And so when Chico had shared this photograph several years ago, my impression was that it was taken in Vail, and that's what I had written down he'd said. But as we went around trying to repeat this photograph, we discovered it was actually taken in Pantano. And the family had moved to Pantano in 1927.
Oh, wow.
Now the tracks have, they realign the tracks a few feet every few years. But the other thing that this photograph shows us is there's big changes in the landscape as far as the vegetation. And a lot of times that presents a real challenge.
Yeah, I think we'll see it in one of the photos coming up. And again, this is an example of, you can see here, I think something happened to this lens. It's not centered properly, but from this whole side here, there's a massive amount of distortion. You can see the girl here on the left, her face and body is squashed, and the hill, this is tucked in quite a bit. And actually, so I think that it makes the shape of the hill look different. And so when you see, when we go to the present photo,
he's also a historian,
how different the line of that hill is. And I think all of that is coming down to the lens that was used in the original photograph. And so that would be something like, if we were trying to repeat this exactly, we could. I mean, we could do it now with digital tools. We can go in and try and emulate that same distortion and warping. But again, we have to decide, like, is it more valuable to have something that is actually, square, or does it make sense to try and repeat the flaws in the original photo? So there's so many different little technical things you can go back and forth on forever. But
yeah. Okay, this is the schoolhouse at Pantano. The new schoolhouse was built in 1927. But prior to 1927, their school was made out of railroad ties. Can you imagine what OSHA would say about that? Yeah, and so this was a challenge. There's the hill to the right. So go ahead and you can.
Yeah, so there are quite a few challenges in this one, right? Because you can see that the vegetation is much different. And actually, one of the posts in the ground is still there. And that was what was what JJ and Ken used to line up this photograph. And also the hill. But the hill itself has changed. You know, again, we think of these land fixtures as being permanent. Well, there's been some mining and excavating and digging on that, and it's changed the shape. And so sometimes it can be hard to line fixtures you think you'd be able to line up on aren't there. But again, like the creosote here is very thick, and so that again makes it really hard to see.
Yeah, there's one post is left, and anyway, we were super excited. You could see where some of the others had been, but one post still remains standing. And you can't see it in this picture, unfortunately. It's behind that darn creosote. But we were trying to get the the curvature of the hill correct. But we were super excited to find that post
Showing all
to be able to line this up.
telling us what they mean. I mean, what they.
Okay. Okay. This is Pantano in 1880. And Robin, are you here today? Maybe not. She's back in Maine. Robin and I went out tromping around and did a repeat photograph of this in April of this year. So this photograph was taken by a man named Watkins and in 1880. And when the railroad was being built by the Southern Pacific, this was basically the end of the line. They were continuing to build. And you can see their camp. This is the first location of the town of Pantano. In 1888, it was relocated about a mile to the north. But looking at a photograph like this, we can really observe changes in the landscape. We can see that there's just nothing left. We can see the changes in the vegetation. Where all the cottonwood trees are in the background, that's where Cienega Creek is.
Wow.
Yeah, Creek must have changed. It's so beautiful how they just.
It's amazing, really.
Yeah. Up for trees now.
Yeah, everything is changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then this is also another photograph that's challenging to recreate because it was most likely taken with a 4x5 glass plate camera. And so the imaging surface is very, very large. And because of that, you can use a really long focal length lens and still get a wide angle image. And so to try and recreate it is, you have to do some math and try and figure out what you think the sensor size of the original photo was, and then try and take a best guess at what you think the focal length of that lens was, and this is one where we don't know. So a lot of we're probably going to try and do some trial and error repeat of this to try and get that exact match. But this is a stitched panorama to try and recreate that. So,
neat.
And part of why sometimes getting those really technical things right is that all of those little changes in focal length and camera placement and sensor size change the apparent relationship of things in the background to the foreground, and so it can make lining up the mountains tricky. So
Nice.
Okay, so we've been kind of talking about this stuff as we go along, but what are some of the changes you can observe? Repeat photography. You know, I'm a historian, so I tend to think of things in that way, but you can use it for so many things. We can observe changes in the vegetation, land use, built environment. There are some great repeat photography projects documenting glaciers, weather events, all kinds of things. Okay, Sheila.
Yeah, okay.
You
Yeah,
recognize some of this.
I do.
Okay, so there is a new development going in at Via Rancho del Lago and Colossal Cave Road. It's basically at the site of the historic Rancho del Lago estate that was built in the 1930s. And then before that, it was the homestead and farm of a succession of families, the Month and Tattersfields, the Crane and Fraker. But we decided to really document this new neighborhood. And so Sheila and I get out there every week between the two of us. And this is another point. If you're going to take on what I would call a shorter term repeat photography project, you got to have some partners, because, you know, things happen in people's lives. Maybe you have to go out of town, different things happen. And so you need a team of people who are going to make sure that those repeat photographs get taken on a regular basis. So by the time we're going to continue doing this, and by the time we're done, you know, in 6 months, we're going to have houses there, and people will start living there again. There are other perspectives that we're taking this scene from. And then there's a 360 series that's taken actually on the site. So, and we've talked a little bit about some of this. The thing I'm really super excited about is starting to retake some of the photographs with historic cameras and seeing what kind of a difference that's going to make in the quality of the repeat photos that we get. And then how are we going to use them? I think they're a great call to action. Sometimes we can use these photographs to help engage the community. Once I think people see and understand their impacts. One project that Vail Preservation Society is pushing forward right now is pushing forward the idea of creating a trail along a historic rail bed to connect Vail with the new library in the future as an extension park. So we've taken some photographs that we hope are going to be that call to action. So lots of ways to use repeat photography. So I think we have just a few minutes. We wanted to save a few minutes for questions or comments or sharing, you know, photographs that that you might have taken.
It was really nice. I mean, the use of the repeat photography really does show just lots of different changes in the landscape and the structures, and I'm surprised by sort of I'm a little surprised by the absence of structures as well as the gain. I mean, I know about ghost towns, I know about abandonment, but still, it's interesting to, like, I always assume something else replaces a building, you know.
You know, and I think, okay, that these repeat photographs also tell really this change in settlement patterns, or how people use the community. And I think the other thing it tells is that very early on, people didn't waste anything. And so say the buildings at the Cooperite mine, or a lot of the buildings that used to be at the Vail town site, when people had to move to follow jobs or work, they dismantled things and took what they could.
Right.
And in the case of the railroad, as technology advanced and they started shutting down little railroad sites, or maybe they didn't need, because Vail used to have one of those cute little passenger depots.
Right.
And it was right across the street from, or right across the tracks from the old Vail post office. But as the railroad weren't making money on that anymore, that building got changed to a 3-sided structure, and then finally in about 1968 dismantled entirely.
Yeah.
So, and in other cases, the railroad would sell buildings or move them, relocate them. So things started to disappear. And because Vail never incorporated, developers could come in and just bulldoze things. And basically that's what happened to the Rancho del Lago
Yeah.
estate.
Wow.
And other buildings at the Vail town site. Yeah, so those pictures do tell that bigger,
Yeah.
when you're able to dive in deeper and really get into the weeds, which is a great thing sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the weeds, that Pantano town site picture, the 1880 compared with what you and Robin did this year with the creek vegetation is really interesting. Now, I have a feeling that the creek is in the 1880 is buried a little bit because there is the focal, there is the difference in camera and so forth. But, you know, you can kind of tell where it is. But boy, you compared with the modern one, it's like, wow, has the vegetation changed?
Well, and part of that also could be the time of year.
Could be.
That this picture was taken.
Yeah,
So that's an important thing too, is to try to discover what time of year. So we took this in April, and the trees were, you know, had that wonderful fresh green.
Yeah.
So it's possible. Okay, you know what? I'm going to think about that. Okay, now that I'm thinking more and more about this, all that stuff's really important to think about with the pictures. So the facilitating train from Tucson to Pantano, the first facilitating train, which would take passengers to Pantano, left from Tucson on April 24th, 1880. So that photograph maybe was taken in March. It's hard to say. Yeah, but we could probably actually find that out with a little more research. Yeah, but this photograph was taken, I think, towards the end of April. I think that's when we went out there.
Well, now this is about when overgrazing really was beginning in Arizona. And you got to wonder, you know, if part of that is overgrazing, not just seasonality.
Well, exactly. And look at all the mesquites that are in there now. And that's a result of overgrazing. Yeah. And it looks like there's really nothing left, but when one gets down there and walks really methodically, there's, you know, there's some of the, a little bit of the rail bed and some little objects and artifacts.
Yeah. The vegetation change on the creek, though, is we've seen that elsewhere in Arizona. There's been a lot of repeat photography of riparian areas, and we've seen them go from more meadowy, wetland-like environments, a ciénaga, to more wooded environments, probably because of shifts in flow, incisement, maybe some groundwater loss, a variety of reasons. But it's just neat to see it here.
Oh, yeah. And it's hard to imagine if we can't actually see it. Yeah. Okay, well.
I was going to jump in. Sorry, so I'm here. I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the work of Jim Malusa on campus. Jim Malusa in the School of Natural Resources, he is a vegetation cover specialist who does, who's been doing repeat photography throughout Southern Arizona. And he, you know, in a recent presentation I saw him do, he talked about his mentor, whose name I've forgotten, who was kind of the father of repeat photography. But so the University of Arizona has a long history of academics using repeat photography for a variety of reasons. His particular interest is the vegetation change. And I think he might be a good resource for you, both in terms of offering photo points that you may not be aware of, but also in terms of his own take on some of your photographs in terms of vegetation cover change. I can put his his contact info in the chat.
Oh, that's perfect. I just wrote down his name. And I'll bet he was referring to the Changing Mile. And let me think, Hastings and Turner.
Mhm.
Mhm.
The other thing I was going to mention is that, you know, archaeologists do photo point monitoring all the time, you know, for archaeological sites, and they go out at different times of the year, and they try to establish that datum pretty early. But I just would like to ask a few of those whether there are some specific sites here that those photo points go back a ways too. I think the site stewards might know that. So, or Courtney Rose.
Oh
Just
yeah,
out of
absolutely.
curiosity, you know, are there photo points there that have gone back a while that we don't know about? Because we know we know archaeologists have been out there working in that Cienega Creek for a long time because of the paleontological research.
Yeah.
You know, not so much paleontological, but early humans, mammoth stuff. They've been out there a long time. So
Yeah.
we ought to ask Courtney when we talk to her about that.
Okay. No, that's really good. And it kind of brings up another thing that I always think about with repeat photography and whether a particular photograph should be used in interpretation or in an exhibit or made public, because you want to get a community or residents on board with being stewards and caretakers, but you don't want to encourage you know, sites to be damaged, places to be damaged.
Well, I was just thinking about that on the Pantano Historic Site, that photo that you've got, where you said there are a lot of objects remaining there. I hope metal detectors and other people, as recreation kind of expands in this area due to increasing population, I hope they don't discover it.
I hope not. And it's actually
is that state land? Who manages that?
It's the Cienega Creek Preserve, and that's
Okay.
sites difficult to get to.
Yeah.
So that's always a reservation that I have.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is. Because a lot of times people really don't understand how important it is not to disturb things.
Mm-hmm.
It's critically important.
Mm-hmm.